Let's look at a warning from the Apostle Peter. I'm quoting scripture now. Then Yahweh knows how to deliver the holy out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who walk according to the flesh, in the lust of uncleanness and despise authority. They are presumptuous, self-willed. They are not afraid to speak evil of dignitaries. Now, remember that word, dignitaries. Whereas angels who are greater in power and might do not bring a reviling accusation against them before Yahweh. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, New King James Version. In the first chapter of the book of Galatians, we find the first evidence that Paul, the apostle, has been falsely attributed to words that were never his by men who had an invested interest in making it seem as if Paul said no more law. In chapter 1, verses 13 and 14 of Galatians, Paul reveals his torrid past in that he both excelled in Judaism and persecuted the true saints of Yahweh. These saints were falsely perceived as uniformly breaking the law of Yahweh. Falsely perceived. Yet, when Paul was converted, he was in agreement with them. He became their biggest advocate. All throughout the book of Acts we see this. Paul also notes that he was zealous for the traditions of his fathers. Not the traditions of Yahweh, the traditions of his fathers. Paul's fathers were his rabbinical teachers, which in Paul's time were called Sadducees. So we're taking a little look at Paul's life here to find out what type of person he was. This will help us to understand what he became. He came to an understanding of what this world has since been blinded to. And that is the distinction between the laws of Yahweh and the laws of man being passed off as the laws of Yahweh. This failure to discern between what is true and the counterfeit has been around since the beginning of sin. This is not a new thing. It's called deception. And it is the devil's greatest weapon. But the pride of knowledge, which is something that Paul had to struggle with, so did Solomon, prevents many believers from ever realizing this deception. I don't think we got that. But the pride of knowledge prevents many believers from ever realizing that this deception affects them too. Usually because of our zealousness, we speak too soon before we have fully investigated the subject. And the gift of discernment, which we have, fails us. It can't operate unless we're patient. Ever wonder why they're always walking in the scriptures and never running? There's an energy to that. The scriptures tells us to walk the walk of faith, not run the sprint of faith. There's an energy to that. We need to be observant. We will see this more clearly as we go deeper. in Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. Paul lets us know an extremely important fact whose awareness will completely cut through and challenge the incorrectly translated scriptures that follow. After Paul spent time alone with the scroll of Yeshayahu, Isaiah, and the Messiah as his only teacher for some 5 years in the wilderness, he returned to Jerusalem to speak with Kepha and Yaakov, Peter and James. Yaakov, the brother of our beloved Messiah. 14 years later, how many? 14 years later, Paul again went up to Jerusalem, this time with both Barnabas and Titus, to speak to the leaders of the faith, to communicate to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. I'm now quoting scripture. Communicate to them that gospel which I preach to the Gentiles, but privately to those of reputation. Can we all say dignitaries?
Dignitaries.
Hello, somebody. Not to speak evil of dignitaries. Lest by any means I might run, or had run, in vain. So why did he do this? To get checked out by his brothers, the leaders in the faith, as to whether or not he was teaching correct doctrine. Everybody got that? This is scripture. The salient point to bring to our awareness, however, is that, and everybody listen, in both of his trips to speak with the leaders of the true faith, never once was there a mention of disagreement with Paul over doctrine. In point of fact, they met both times specifically to discuss doctrine so that Paul could be sure that he was teaching correctly. Wow. Note also that it was 14 years later. 14 years later, which Paul came again to check himself to be sure that he was teaching the gospel correctly. So now let's add it up. You have 5 years in the wilderness. He comes to get checked out. Then 14 years later, that's 19 years of training for Paul to be ready. And this was a man who was at the higher echelon of Judaism before he even started. It takes seasoning. 1 Timothy and the book of Titus tells us this about becoming a leader in the faith. You don't just do it overnight. This time, however, he even brought along 2 disciples, Barnabas and Titus, as witnesses. Now check this out. So that if he were going to be reproached for incorrect teaching, then they would know that he was a false apostle and they should leave him. That's why they were there. Let me tell you something. As a master martial artist, there's a lot of pride in the martial arts. And rarely have I ever seen a situation where an expert or a master at the art takes any students with them when they think they might be defeated. Paul was brave enough to take 2